The newspaper towards the beginning of the very first episode of Don't Hug Me, I'm Scared is perhaps an indication of the work's political subtext. Its title, The Right Wing. And if this headline is any indication, the stock market in this little world is doing quite well. Why is this one of the first things we see in Don't Hug Me, I'm Scared? Is it just an arbitrary detail? Given the disturbing nature of what occurs in the series, it would seem that the work is calling into question a very common position that has been espoused by the contemporary right. That is to say, perhaps the work is suggesting that the stock market, and to a broader extent, perhaps other economic indicators such as gross domestic product, are not the best indicators of a society's overall health. Don't Hug Me, I'm Scared is an enigmatic work, and I don't mean to suggest that I have some kind of unique or exclusive access to its meaning, nor do I think there is a fully coherent political message being presented here. Rather, I think the work introduces an element of ambiguity into certain narratives which serve as the basis for neoliberal capitalist hegemony. And, well, in order to talk about that, I need to talk about this dude. No, not him. Not him. Not him either. Yeah, that guy. Karl Marx. Are you ready for a Marxist analysis, folks? Hello and welcome to Nightmare Masterclass. My name is David Stockdale. I'll be your host on this excursion into the dark unknown. Thank you for joining me. This is the third part of my Critical Approaches series, in which I'm seeking to unpack the viral horror masterpiece, Don't Hug Me, I'm Scared. In this installment, I will be using a Marxist lens to analyze the work. And I'm pleased to say that Don't Hug Me, I'm Scared really lends itself to a Marxist analysis. You don't necessarily need to watch my first two videos in order to understand this one, but if you want additional context, it would probably help. Before we get started, let me just say that if you enjoy my content and want to support me on a monthly basis, you can do so for as little as $1 a month on Patreon. I have various tiers, so please go to patreon.com/Nightmare Masterclass and see what works for you. Now, there is much to be said about Karl Marx, and I certainly don't think I'm going to cover everything in this here video, but I do think we can use Don't Hug Me, I'm Scared as a sort of jumping off point from which certain philosophical insights put forth by Marx might be further elucidated. There is an absolute goldmine of material out there for anyone looking to read up on Marx, so please refer to my references and additional reading links in the video description. First, I just want to give you a bit of historical background. By situating Marx in his own time and place, we can come to understand him in his own terms. We do so not as part of some esoteric philosophical exercise, but in order to determine what can be taken from Marx and applied to the present moment. Marx's intellectual project was largely based on values and ideas popularized during the Enlightenment. In his younger years, Marx was what you might call a radical lowercase d Democrat. He opposed slavery, supported universal suffrage, opposed capital punishment, and strongly advocated for freedom of the press. At the age of 24, Marx wrote, "The free press is the ubiquitous vigilant eye of a people's soul." Excuse me. The embodiment of a people's faith in itself. The eloquent link that connects the individual with the state and the world. The embodied culture that transforms material struggles into intellectual struggles and idealizes their crude material form. It is a people's frank confession to itself, and the redeeming power of confession is well known. It is a spiritual mirror in which a people can see itself, and self-examination is the first condition of wisdom. Marx's views on a number of things changed over time, but one common thread is apparent throughout the body of his work. Marx was highly concerned with human freedom, where freedom is defined here simply as self-directed human activity. And he was dedicated to the general advancement of human development. Insofar as we can know a person's inner motivations, it's fairly clear that Marx's concern with the development and expansion of human freedom is precisely what drove him to become a socialist. Per Marx and his bestie Friedrich Engels, only in community with others has each individual the means of cultivating his gifts in all directions. Only in the community, therefore, is personal freedom possible. In previous substitutes for the community, in the state, etc., personal freedom has existed only for the individuals who developed within the relations of the ruling class, and only insofar as they were individuals of this class. So, for instance, during the feudal epoch, lords enjoyed more freedoms than serfs, and in the capitalist system, those with a lot of money enjoy far more personal freedom than the poor. Because of this, Marx came to favor the extension of democracy, that is, rule by the people, not only to the political sphere, but also the economic. So, what exactly does it mean to be a Marxist? Well, Marxism, I think, is basically interchangeable with the term historical materialism. First off, materialism is a mode of understanding that is rooted in the idea that matter is what constitutes all of reality, and that the things we typically associate with the ethereal, ideas, emotions, etc., stem first from the material world. A historical materialist approach centralizes the manner in which humans have reproduced and sustained themselves over time. As Marx and Engels put it, men can be distinguished from animals by consciousness, by religion, or anything else you like. They themselves begin to distinguish themselves from animals as soon as they begin to produce their means of subsistence, a step which is conditioned by their physical organization. By producing their means of subsistence, men are indirectly producing their actual material life. So the historical materialist approach is concerned first and foremost with the site of production. In particular, Marx looks at how people produce the necessities for their daily lives. Embedded within the historical materialist approach is the idea that the way in which people organize production in a given society has significant and widespread consequences for other elements of that society. Historical materialism can be understood largely in opposition to idealism, the notion that ideas are really what drive historical development. In the German ideology, Marx and Engels distinguish the materialist conception of history from the idealist. It, i.e., historical materialism, does not explain practice from the idea, but explains the formation of ideas from material practice. And accordingly, it comes to the conclusion that all forms and products of consciousness cannot be dissolved by mental criticism, by resolution into self-consciousness, or transformation into apparitions, specters, fancies, etc., but only by the practical overthrow of the actual existing social relations which gave rise to this idealistic humbug, that not criticism but revolution is the driving force of history, also of religion, of philosophy, and other types of theory. In other words, major historical changes do not occur as a result of people spontaneously landing on new ideas, Rather, historical changes come about through revolutions which are enabled via the existing material conditions of the time. In a lengthy critique of German philosopher Max Stirner, Marx spelled out the problem with looking at history solely in terms of the dominant ideas of the time. The speculative idea, the abstract conception, is made the driving force of history, and history is thereby turned into a mere history of philosophy. But even as the latter is not conceived as according to existing sources, it actually took place, not to mention how it evolved under the influence of real historical relations, but as it was understood and described by recent German philosophers, in particular Hegel and Feuerbach. Thus, history becomes a mere history of illusory ideas, a history of spirits and ghosts, while the real, empirical history that forms the basis of this ghostly history is only utilized to provide bodies for these ghosts. From it are borrowed the names required to clothe these ghosts with the appearance of reality. For Marx, the lack of a concerted attachment to materialism leads to an understanding of history that doesn't have a real basis. Instead, it becomes something which reflects or hinges upon ideology. In this case, a mere history of philosophy. Why is this? The problem is, in part, the tendency to conflate matters of cause and effect. But it isn't as though Marx doesn't take into account the possibility that certain ideas might have an effect on society. He just thinks they're always necessarily mediated by the existing material conditions of the time. In the words of his friend Engels, while the material mode of existence is the primum agens, primary agent, primary cause, this does not preclude the ideological spheres from reacting upon it in their turn, though with a secondary effect. And of course, to complicate matters further, the lens through which one understands history is always necessarily mediated by the dominant ideas of one's time. In Stirner's case, it was the ideas of Hegel and Feuerbach, two highly influential philosophers who were very much in fashion at the time. And to be sure, Marx was highly influenced by Hegel and, to a lesser extent, Feuerbach as well. But while Hegel took the conservative view that the Prussian state was the ideal political model, Marx believed society had not yet reached the so-called end of history. The explanatory power of historical materialism should not be underestimated. In Marx's magnum opus, Capital, a critique of political economy, Marx offered what is known as an immanent critique of the capitalist mode of production. Through a scrutinous examination and extrapolation of ideas postulated by other prominent economic theorists, namely Adam Smith and David Ricardo, Marx arrived at a number of rather disturbing conclusions, foremost of which is Marx's insight that the entire basis of capitalism is the exploitation of workers, that is to say, the appropriation of surplus value by capitalists from the workers. And if that weren't earth-shattering enough, Marx further postulated that due to both the declining rate of profit and the tendency for capitalism to continually revolutionize production, the capitalist mode of production, when generalized, contained within it the seeds of its own undoing. In other words, the problem with capitalism is eventually you run out of other people's money. Beyond a certain point, the productive capacity of society will be such that capitalism will simply no longer be viable. Most people in the world trade their labor in exchange for wages, which they use to live. Capitalists, however, advance money into the production of commodities in order to make more money than they put in. But importantly, the substance of value is human labor power. Capitalists need workers in order to produce commodities. Now, Marx certainly wasn't the first to say that labor is the source of value. Both Smith and Ricardo believe that as well. But Marx did have his own unique take on the idea. In Capital Volume 1, Marx postulated that value in capitalism is determined by the amount of socially necessary labor time that goes into making a commodity. It's also important to note that Marx's argument doesn't rely on a moral understanding of the term exploitation. Rather, Marx shows that workers do not receive the full value of what they generate by virtue of their role in the process. In short, by virtue of their labor. In broader philosophical terms, Marx did argue that the bourgeois conception of human rights, which underpins the framework of capitalism, hinges upon a certain state of unfreedom, particularly for the working class. The capitalist system is contingent upon the rampant exploitation of the working class. That is to say, the appropriation of surplus value from the working class by the capitalist class. And in a certain sense, the capitalist workplace is nothing more than a dictatorship in which workers are materially coerced into performing labor without ever having a say in how the product of their labor is used. And so, for Marx, the pursuit of human freedom in the modern age necessarily entails the eventual abolition of capitalism as the general mode of production in favor of a democratically controlled economy, i.e., socialism. At this point, you might have all sorts of Soviet-themed images in your head of big, burly dudes with hammers and wrenches, but it's important to keep in mind that Marx does not advocate for workers because they're like inherently great people. He simply argues that workers are in a good position to seize the means of production because they're already in the immediate proximity to the site of production. I mean, who else is going to do it? The middle managers or the HR reps? So, how does historical development happen? In order to shed light on the Marxist perspective, we're going to need to further parse the philosophical distinction between materialism and idealism. Let's consider the so-called great man theory of history, the idea that major developments in history are driven primarily by the actions of singular great actors. You know what I'm talking about, right? Lincoln freed the slaves, that sort of thing. The general narrative that sole actors enact historical change through sheer will or some special characteristics such as intellect, charisma, etc., is a clean and simple way to explain history, but it's not accurate and it's not even sufficient for young children. The truth is, very rarely do individuals influence history in such a way, and even when they do have a profound impact, it is only through the existing material conditions of the time that they were able to do so. Major changes in the social structure of society don't simply spring up from nowhere. New systems aren't magically instantiated from the brains of world leaders or so-called iconoclasts. Rather, they are products of existing elements of previous systems. These elements are further developed and generalized into new arrangements. The feudal mode of Europe emerged from the slave system of the Roman Empire, and similarly, capitalism emerged from feudalism. According to Marx, history proper can essentially be understood as the struggle of various classes in society vying for power over time. After all, the opening line of the Communist Manifesto is, "All history is the history of class struggle." In feudalism, the struggle was between the lords and the serfs. In capitalism, the struggles between the bourgeoisie, the capitalist class, and the proletariat, the working class. Marx envisioned a time when material interests would no longer necessitate conflict. In short, the abolition of class itself. He referred to this political goal as communism. There are many different routes a Marxist analysis can take. I certainly don't want you to think the following interpretation is the definitive Marxist approach. Rather, it's just one way the framework might be applied. For starters, I would like to point out that Don't Hug Me, I'm Scared is an independent art project which has largely achieved a type of cult status with a niche audience. Importantly, the series was not funded by one of the major TV networks, and it wasn't funded by Disney or Netflix. Since the work falls outside of this paradigm, it does stand to reason that it just might have something interesting to say about the dominant modes of cultural production. That is not to say that works that fall within the parameters of mainstream entertainment can't offer good critiques of hegemonic values, but there is simply less of a chance with an independent project such as DHMIS that subversive elements get filtered out by risk-averse producers, executives, etc. Now, it is unfortunately the case that the new Don't Hug Me, I'm Scared series seems to have been tabled for now. And so it goes with artists under capitalism who are subject to the whims of financiers. As for the thematic content of DHMIS, well, there's certainly a lot to say. But first, let's just come to an understanding regarding what is going on in the series. In the first video, the entire scene is revealed to be a studio. It's clear that these various presentations are part of a production, most likely a children's television series. What is essential to understand here is that the show is a commodity, or rather, perhaps it would be more appropriate to say that ad time is the commodity. This might not be evident upon a cursory viewing of the series, but a number of elements strongly lead to the conclusion that the show is being produced for a profit. Even in the popular conception of Don't Hug Me, I'm Scared, the general consensus seems to be that a certain someone has in some way appropriated the creative endeavors of the show's actual creator, Bread Guy. There's a fair amount of evidence in the work that supports this idea. And as I'm sure you're aware if you're watching this video, many fan theories propagated in the wake of Don't Hug Me, I'm Scared. YouTube theorist Matthew Patrick, aka MatPat, postulates that DHMIS represents, quote-unquote, a children's television show corrupted by the influence of advertising. And you know what? This actually is not a bad take. I find a lot of the underlying assumptions of the theory to be on point, especially Roy's role as the financial backer of the TV show. But MatPat doesn't quite go far enough into the analysis of capitalism for my liking. See, I think it's important to ask deeper questions about the systems that lead to certain kinds of behavior being prevalent. Like, why is it that one would seek to insert a product into a children's television program? Of course, the answer is to make money. I'm not trying to be obtuse about that, but what the fuck is money anyway? And why is it that such an activity would be profitable in the first place? This is a question we can't really answer without a scrutinous analysis of capitalism as it presents itself in the work. There are numerous elements in the fictional universe of DHMIS which serve to justify and reinforce the world's economic base, i.e., the dynamic by which Roy maintains his authoritative position in the capitalist hierarchy. Let's begin first with the notepad. The first episode entails the crafting of an ideological foundation upon which the ruling class justifies its position in society. The notepad is the first in a series of inanimate objects which come to life and give various lessons to the central characters, and its role in the work can't be underestimated. After the notepad sings, "What's your favorite idea? Mine is being creative," Yellow Guy poses a question to the notepad. How did you get the idea? As noted in my first video on the series, The notepad responds in a tautological fashion. I just try to think creatively. In order to be creative, one needs to think creatively. It's the first of many instances in the series of tautological thinking and other fallacious sort of reasoning. I discussed the first video extensively in my first Critical Approaches installment, so for the sake of brevity, let me just say that I believe tautologies are employed to demonstrate that the notepad's authoritative position is not justified via reason, but rather with some kind of magical force. The notepad establishes within the work the ideological foundations of a hierarchy, and it's one in which the three central characters are decidedly at the bottom. In the second video, one might say that the purpose of this here clock is to craft an understanding of time that both fits within and supports the ideological schema established in the first video. The very first lines of the song are as follows. Time is a tool you can put on your wall or wear it on your wrist. The past is far behind us, the future doesn't exist. Let's first call attention to the clock's choice of words. Time is a tool. In this song, the idea of time itself is used as a tool for nefarious purposes. The very concept of time is turned against the central characters to instill horror and, more importantly, obedience, blind obedience. Further note how the lyrics serve to create distance between the present and the past. An ahistorical understanding of reality is necessary in order to instill complacency within the central characters. They can't be allowed to remember a time when things were better. Moreover, they can't be allowed to envision a better future. Recall the line, "The future doesn't exist." In this work, we see a highly abstracted version of reality, which is made to seem real by various characters in the work, namely the inanimate objects which come to life in each installment. It evokes Marx's understanding of commodities, spelled out at the very beginning of Capital Volume 1. Namely, I'm talking about the commodity fetish. The commodity fetish is the process by which the social relationships that give rise to the commodity form are made to look like inherent properties of a given commodity. When you see a commodity in the marketplace, you don't see the work that went into it. You don't see the working conditions, and you certainly don't see the power dynamics between the various workers and their respective bosses. Rather, you see a price. And while price and exchange value aren't necessarily synonymous in the Marxist framework, the price does serve as an indicator, something pointing in the direction of the item's value. This number, or rather the principles behind this number, are made to seem like facts of life, every bit as real as Newton's laws of motion. I do think the work has something to say about the commodity fetish. Don't Hug Me, I'm Scared is the felt version of our world in which the fetish character of commodities is laid bare, in which inanimate objects are endowed with an inner world of their very own vis-a-vis these cute little googly eyes. But of course, considerably more visceral depictions occur in each installment. For instance, the first video depicts the central characters taking slices of a delicious-looking cake. Within the cake, however, is some kind of grotesque meat. Considering the grotesque content of a certain later installment, it stands to reason that meat is perhaps meant to evoke some type of cannibalism, and perhaps to a broader extent, the concept of death. The cake is just one instance of an object that appears to be something it's not. The idea that there is a grotesque truth hidden beneath the appearance of things is a theme that appears all throughout the work, and it's one that I think Marx would certainly appreciate. Later in the fifth installment, we are presented with a veritable feast of commodities, some of which are promoted and some of which are said to, quote, make your teeth go gray. This is very obviously some kind of cheeky play on the concept of product placement or native advertising. What's perhaps a bit more interesting to me here is the fifth video's climax. So, towards the beginning of this one, our duck friend muses to himself, something's missing. The camera then cuts to a drawing of the characters with the red guy outside looking at duck and yellow guy. One gets the sense that distance has been created between the central characters. This brings up a very important point when it comes to a Marxist understanding of the capitalist workplace. In capitalism, workers are both alienated from themselves and one another. The atomization of workers is a necessity to maintain the capitalist order. It prevents coordinated efforts such as strikes. One common tactic bosses tend to employ in order to prevent such actions is turning workers against one another. And when you know it, the fifth installment of DHMIS culminates in Yellow Guy eating his co-star, the duck. The fifth video is a pivotal moment in the series. It marks the departure of Red Guy from the show's production. In the final scene of Don't Hug Me, I'm Scared 5, we see Red Guy walking away in the rain with the suitcase. Where is he going? Note that the red guy is the only character routinely played by a human wearing a costume. Further note the literal depiction of the outside world here, which can be contrasted with, well, every prior event in the series. In the sixth and final video, Red Guy wakes up in an office. Again, we are shown a considerably more realistic depiction of the setting, rather than the felt version we've grown accustomed to. This is a stark divergence. Why does this series jump from a magical puppet world to this live-action setting? For starters, I would say the work is attempting to convey the distinction between a certain kind of labor in contemporary life, namely menial office work, from the creative work associated with something like a children's television show. In this exchange, Red Guy attempts to entertain his colleagues by suggesting the possibility that the file might take on a life of its own. He is routinely dismissed. Later, Red Guy presents a low-rent version of the song initially shown to us in the very first installment of the series, and the crowd is unmerciful. Based on this, it's clear that Red Guy lacks the funds necessary to showcase his ideas in the way that he really envisions them. Hell, he has to work at this dreary office just to make ends meet. I don't think it's too much of a stretch to say that there's a thematic connection here between poor Yellow Guy drowning in oil and Red Guy's menial office job. How is it that these various inanimate objects have come to resemble maligned apparitions whose sole purpose seems to be to indoctrinate these poor characters? Is it just some kind of evil magic? No. It's because Roy owns and controls the means of production, and therefore he calls the shots. In turn, Red Guy has been relegated to a subservient position, despite the apparent fact that the show is his brainchild. Roy's position is one of authority and, importantly, creative control. Much of the horror elicited by the work is a direct result of Roy's authoritarian control over the product, the children's program, which serves as the vehicle for his profit-seeking activity. It's only at this point that we can truly begin to appreciate the thematic depth of Don't Hug Me, I'm Scared. The basic premise of every episode, everything we've seen thus far in the series, is revealed to be a product of Red Guy's creative efforts. However, it would seem that his various ideas have been co-opted in order to create profits for the show's owner, Roy, and thus have been horrifically distorted in the process. In turn, Red Guy has become alienated from his creative work on the children's television show. Everything the Red Guy has worked for has been twisted into a hellish version of itself. Recall that the 6th installment is ostensibly on the topic of dreams, and by this point in the series, it's readily apparent that Red Guy's dream of making a fun and educational show for kids has become a profit-seeking nightmare. I would venture to guess this is why we see him leaving at the end of the 5th video. DHMIS is about the commodity fetish as it relates to a product of entertainment, in this case, a children's program. Moreover, it's about the alienation of its creator, the Red Guy, as he attempts to navigate a world of compromises and creative frustration due to his antagonistic relationship with his employer, Roy. The Red Guy's creative efforts are appropriated and subsumed into the capitalist framework. His conception of a fun educational show for children is commodified, turned into a thing that is sold for a profit. And if that wasn't bad enough, the product itself is compromised by flagrant product placement and, worse yet, an overtly propagandistic message. The central theme of this product is decidedly not liberatory. It is regressive. It seeks to nullify the audience into a passive state of complacent obedience, rather than enable them to emancipate themselves. Simply put, every episode of the show is ideological propaganda that serves to reinforce the ruling class. Once more, I will quote Marx and Engels. The ideas of the ruling class are, in every epoch, the ruling ideas, i.e., the class which is the ruling material force of society is at the same time its ruling intellectual force. The class which has the means of material production at its disposal has control at the same time over the means of mental production, so that thereby, generally speaking, the ideas of those who lack the means of mental production are subject to it. The ruling ideas are nothing more than the ideal expression of the dominant material relationships. The dominant material relationships grasped as ideas, hence of the relationships which can make one class the ruling one, therefore the ideas of its dominance. My basic understanding of the occurrences in the series is that once Red Guy understands his role in perpetuating this process, not only does he opt out, but he also seems to figure out a way to pull the plug on the whole production. Though, of course, the final scene of the series would seem to indicate that the show has been rebooted with new actors. One can observe all manner of peculiar reactions to the phenomenon of late capitalism. Many seek escapism, and I certainly don't judge them for it, but the current epoch is marked by a very strange form of escapism. It's seen in the tendency for folks to look to the stars, not in wonder or scientific curiosity even, but rather desperation, because, increasingly it seems as though our own planet is doomed. Above all, the defining ethos of late capitalism in 2020 is hopelessness. It's a conditioned response to a vast number of seemingly insurmountable problems. Let's think back to that newspaper, the right wing, stocks flying high. Up until fairly recently, the stock market's performance was one of Trump's major talking points. Of course, that was prior to the major downturn brought about by the COVID-19 outbreak. The pandemic is thought to be an externality by mainstream economists. By their account, capitalism is made up of individuals acting in their own self-interest. making agreements in a voluntary manner. But the coronavirus will have an untold cost that no one really agreed to take on. It's a cost that governments will have to internalize using taxes. There is plenty of evidence at this point that the Trump administration has mishandled the situation. The term gross negligence comes to mind. With the current state of the US government being what it is, the parties with enough money to actually combat this situation will surely not do so willingly, and politicians are either unable or unwilling to make them do so. It's fairly clear that this will lead to a number of totally preventable deaths. What remains to be seen is the true scale of this catastrophe. With that in mind, let's consider an uncomfortable truth about our American healthcare system. Based on fairly conservative estimates, some 45,000 odd people a year die because they don't have health insurance. We live in a system where there is an acceptable number of people who die because they can't afford health care. And that number is in the tens of thousands. We have people with diabetes rationing their insulin because they can't afford a full supply. We have cancer patients going bankrupt trying to pay for their treatments. This is the status quo in the richest country in the world. It really makes you wonder just how many people the ruling class are prepared to let die during this pandemic simply to maintain some level of profitability. How many people are they ready to sacrifice at the altar of capitalism? This is why those of us on the left tend to describe ardent proponents of capitalism as members of a death cult. They're prioritizing profitability over public health. The virus certainly has had a profoundly negative effect on the economy as well, but a fair argument can be made that the stock market has been overdue for a correction for quite some time. A common view among economists is that a recession has been on the horizon for some time now. The outbreak just so happens to be the event that pushed us into a full-blown crisis. This downturn, in addition to crises such as the 2008 recession, are features of the capitalist system. Previous systems, such as feudalism, have faced crises of underproduction, scarcity, drought, famine, natural occurrences, which lead to the inability of producers to meet demand. We have those, but we also have something that is unique to capitalism. Capitalism is the only system that suffers from crises of overproduction. When businesses produce too much, that is to say, when for whatever reason supply vastly exceeds demand, markets undergo what is known as a correction. Prices fall in order to track demand, cost-cutting leads to job losses, decreased employment leads to even lower demand, broadly speaking, and then you get absurd situations where the number of vacant homes exceeds the number of homeless people. That's what happens when you have commodified housing. This is the sort of ideological baggage that a newspaper known as the Right Wing, a paper which touts the performance of the stock market, brings with it. Where there is a boom, there is always a bust. Where there's an economic expansion, a recession is always on the horizon. Is there a way to break out of this cycle? It is a sign of the times that the capitalist wing of the Democratic Party so ardently opposes someone like Bernie Sanders, a politician who, by all sensible indications, abides by a rather anodyne form of social democracy. And in turn, it is ironic that Sanders and his movement are arguably the only thing standing in the way of a looming climate emergency and ultimately the total collapse of our economy. We have seen what happens when the purveyors of neoliberal capitalism go unchallenged. The world is still dealing with the aftermath of the 2008 recession. One study indicates that an additional 5,000 suicides occurred in 2009 as a result of that economic crisis. A host of other negative health outcomes are associated with economic downturns as well, including low birth weight and smoking while pregnant. Human civilization will either evolve to meet the challenges posed by so-called externalities, such as pandemics and climate disasters, or we will perish. Things are certainly looking dire right now, but I think there are a few reasons to be hopeful. Very rarely are those in the sphere of anti-capitalism presented with the situation in which our ideological opponents have explicitly stated that public health is directly at odds with so-called economic viability. More people than ever are going to be questioning the fundamental basis of our economic system. A whole new ideological space is opening up. Now is our time to shine. We can't lose hope that a better world is possible. That wraps it up for this installment of Nightmare Masterclass. Again, if you'd like to support me on a monthly basis, you can do so for as little as $1 a month on patreon.com/Nightmare Masterclass. Thank you for watching, and good night.